Those of us who study science policy are sometimes accused of ambulance chasing because we devote a lot of our energy and attention to high-profile controversies where there has been or there's about to be some kind of bust-up between science, technology and society. Climate change, GM crops, fracking, badger culling are just a few of the recent examples. And you'll certainly find people working on all of those topics here at Sprue. And at the risk of conforming to that stereotype, I want to start the lecture by talking about a particular crisis that's very prominent in the news right now, and that's the Ebola outbreak that we've seen most nights on our TV screens centred on West Africa. Although this is the 25th known outbreak of Ebola, it's by far the most serious. 3,000 lives have already been lost, and projections suggest that there'll be at least 20,000 cases by November of this year, and potentially anything up to 1 million or more in the first quarter of 2015. It's a crisis with scientific, political, humanitarian and healthcare dimensions. But it's unlikely that the particularly devastating course of this epidemic can be attributed to purely the biological characteristics of the virus. As Jeremy Farrar and Peter Piot argued recently in a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, what we're seeing in the Ebola crisis is much more likely to be a result of dysfunctional health systems, international indifference, local customs, densely populated capitals, and a lack of trust in authorities after years of armed conflict. More than anything else, Ebola has reached a point where it could establish itself as an endemic infection because of an inadequate and overdue global response. Not only did it take more than 3 months to diagnose Ebola as the cause of the epidemic, but it wasn't until 5 months and 1,000 deaths later that a public health emergency was declared, and another 2 months after that before a humanitarian response began to be put in place. The epidemic, in other words, was an avoidable crisis, and I mention it at the start of this talk for 3 reasons. First, it's a sobering reminder of quite how high the stakes can be in the design and operation of scientific advisory processes. Although the global scientific and health communities have debated pandemic preparedness intensively over the past decade, following earlier outbreaks of SARS and avian flu, the various frameworks that were developed have failed miserably in the context of responding to Ebola. Martin Rees, the former president of the Royal Society, warned us in his book Our Final Century a few years ago that a new generation of pandemics could be one of the reasons that we as a species might be entering our final century. The Ebola response suggests that the international community still has some way to go in developing timely and effective approaches to emerging infectious diseases. Indeed, navigating our way through these challenges is one of the reasons that Martin and colleagues have recently established the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University. Second, and more optimistically, we know that it often takes a crisis to spur change. As a recent Nature article argued, the real test of any science advisory system is how it copes with emergencies. Some crack under the strain, but if we look at advisory systems around the world, we also see many examples of crises or particularly fierce controversies providing the trigger for reforms and improvements of various kinds. That was certainly the case here in the UK when the BSE crisis of the late 80s and early 90s led to a collapse of public confidence in scientific and food safety advice. More recently, we've seen a similar pattern in Japan, with intense debate about scientific advice and risk management in the aftermath of the Great East Japan earthquake, the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear accident in March 2011. The global response to Ebola may have been late in coming, but there are now signs that lessons are being taken on board that could be applied ahead of the next epidemic. Third, the response we've seen to Ebola is a reminder that while science and high-quality scientific advice are absolutely vital, they're not by themselves sufficient as solutions to complex social problems. For sure, Ebola demands a large-scale medical response, combining public health measures with behavioural changes, therapies, and when possible, vaccination. But as my colleagues in the STEP Centre here at Sussex have shown, we also need a sensitive appreciation of the cultures of affected communities and the need to design interventions with their engagement and their consent. This requires expertise from diverse disciplines, anthropology as much as pharmacology, and the involvement of diverse players from civil society, governments, development NGOs, academics, and when appropriate, the military. So let me move on from Ebola to some more general observations about the state of scientific advice in the UK and internationally. For those of us who follow these debates, October 2014 is notable because it marks the 50th anniversary of one particular institution which has been very influential in British science policy, that of the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, or GCSA. SPRU, my department, is teaming up with the Royal Society and the Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy a few weeks from now to hold an event celebrating this milestone with contributions from several of the recent and current serving chief scientists. I sometimes liken the GCSA to Doctor Who. Both institutions were founded in the early 60s. Both have been through 11 or now 12 incarnations, and both roles have only been occupied by men. And here we have the William Hartnell figure in the story, Solly, later Lord Zuckerman, who walked through the black door of number 10 on the 18th of October 1964, 3 days after Harold Wilson took over as the Labour Prime Minister, and came out as the first GCSA. Born in South Africa in 1904, Zuckerman had arrived in London aged 26, trained as an anatomist, then as a zoologist, and quickly risen up the ranks of academia before entering Whitehall in his 50s. And he adjusted to the policy world with great flair. Writing his obituary in 1993, Lord Dainton observed that Solly Zuckerman was unique. No scientist this century can match him in the time span and weight of his influence on governments in peace and war. Embraced by the establishment, he could stand aloof from it and be its severest critic. In addition to establishing the office of the GCSA in its modern form, Zuckerman's background in defence research and policy, the knowledge he'd accumulated from what he described later as the macabre science of destruction, made him a powerful and persuasive advocate for constraints on the development and testing of nuclear weapons. He felt a real horror towards the potential use of nuclear weapons in a military setting, and devoted much of his later career to the cause of non-proliferation. He also took an early interest in environmental issues, founding the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, and influencing the creation of the Department of Environment and the Royal Commission for Environmental Pollution in 1970. And although he stepped down formally as GCSA in 1971, he continued to engage in policy for several years after that. Indeed, the former Cabinet Secretary, Richard, now Lord Wilson, recalls being tasked occasionally with managing Solly Zuckerman, who, as he puts it, for some reason continued to pop into the Cabinet Office well into the 1980s. It's important to note that Zuckerman wasn't the first scientific advisor to government. There was a long tradition of scientists working, particularly in the Ministry of Defence, and Zuckerman himself had earlier occupied the role of MOD scientific advisor from 1959 onwards. Before that, during the Second World War, there were fierce conflicts between two prominent scientists who were both advising the MOD and Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, Henry Tizard and Frederick Lindemann. C.P. Snow, in this book, Science and Government, gives a warts and all account of this battle between Tizard and Lindemann, this book drawn from his 1960 Godkin lectures. Snow's particularly damning of Lindemann, who he paints as an indifferent scientist but a skilled social climber who consistently gave Churchill the wrong advice. Tizard, by contrast, drew on a much broader group of scientific experts, provided much higher quality advice, but was too often ignored, particularly in the later stages of the war. And the conclusion that C.P. Snow draws from this episode is an interesting one for us in the present context. He says it's dangerous to have a solitary scientific overlord, and especially dangerous to have him sitting in power with no scientists near him, surrounded by politicians who think of him as some all-wise, all-knowing professor. Snow goes on to argue that there's a kind of scientist to whom we ought not to give any power or choice at all, namely those who succumb to what he calls the euphoria of gadgets and the euphoria of secrecy. The point is, says Snow, anyone who's drunk with gadgets is a menace. The higher he climbs, the more he's going to mislead his country. I think we can all point to examples of that tendency towards the euphoria of gadgets in various aspects of scientific advice today. There's lots in what C.P. Snow says that still has relevance. Indeed, in a very thoughtful foreword to that Science and Government book, Bob May, Lord May, who was GCSA in the UK from 95 to 2000, the period immediately following the BSE crisis, Bob May says it was partly lessons from Lindemann which influenced the UK government's guidelines for science advice in policymaking, which were published at around that time. I won't attempt now to trace in any detail the evolution of the role of the GCSA through the 1970s and 1980s, but suffice to say Zuckerman's shoes were very hard to fill, and for several years the office of GCSA was shunted around different parts of government and had a somewhat reduced status. And I think it was Bob May's appointment in 1995 that again marked something of a turning point. In the lead up to the 1992 general election, Neil Kinnock, then the Labour Party leader, was persuaded to include in the Labour manifesto for that election a commitment to boosting the role of the GCSA to grade 1, to the top tier permanent secretary rank within the civil service, and to give the GCSA an expanded staff and more resources with which to carry out the functions of the office. When Kinnock then unexpectedly lost the election in '92 to John Major, William Waldegrave, who became the Science Minister under Major, persuaded the Prime Minister that the government should take this commitment from the Labour's manifesto and put it into practice in the government of the time. So at that point you see the foundations being laid of the office of the GCSA and the Government Office of Science that surrounds him in its current form. And this is a slide of the Go Science website today. The main development in the period since Bob May, particularly under Sir John Beddington, who was Chief Scientist up until last year, up until 2013, the main development has been the gradual expansion of the network of science advisors beyond the individual GCSA, beyond a few departments where science advisors were also employed, the MOD, Department of Environment, towards the creation of this much bigger network of scientific advisors across all of Whitehall that you see today. And this is a more or less up-to-date list with pictures of them all, including the MI5 science advisor shaded there in black. But this has been a particularly significant feature of the last 10 years, the increase in the number and spread of this network and the extent to which they've worked together collectively as a group of scientific advisors across the system of government. I've just finished a round of interviews I've been doing with recent and serving scientific advisors for an article I'm writing. And the general impression I take from those interviews is of a slow and at times jerky progress towards something which is now firmly institutionalised within Whitehall, but which still continues to develop and evolve. And let me just briefly sidetrack at this point into a personal note as to how I came to take an interest in institutions and processes of scientific advice. For much of the last decade I was working at the think tank Demos, and this was at its trendiest Blairite peak. And the focus of my work there at Demos was the democratic governance of science and technology. So I was much more interested in the role of publics in science policy than in these science policy elites like science advisors. Almost exactly 10 years ago I wrote this report called See Through Science, which called for public engagement in science to move upstream in processes of research and innovation. And it was influenced, this report, in part by the work of science studies scholars like Steve Hilgartner at Cornell, whose book Science on Stage explored expert advice as a form of performance. When we wrote this See Through Science report, we had quite a lot of fun playing around with these theatrical performative metaphors. The context at the time was the Royal Society's report on nanotechnologies, which had been published in 2004. And we described how this particular production, how this particular performance of scientific advice had dazzled the critics. Unusually for the Royal Society, it had relied on an ensemble cast, on the working group that had written the report, alongside the usual principals, fellows of the Royal Society, eminent heads of Cambridge colleges, senior industrialists. We also found some unexpected supporting players, an environmentalist, a social scientist, and a consumer champion. And the performance was imaginatively staged. Aspects were still carefully rehearsed, but there was also room for improvisation. The study consulted widely, it ran workshops with stakeholders and published evidence on its website. It was also deliberately avant-garde. Anyone familiar with the Royal Society's earlier work could spot instantly that the style had changed. The tone was unusually precautionary, social and ethical issues received prominent billing, uncertainty and dialogue were recurring motifs. Of course, when I was writing all this stuff about the Royal Society, little did I know that only 4 or 5 years later I'd end up joining the troupe when I was hired by Martin Rees, then the president, to set up the Society's new Science Policy Centre. So for a few years I got to smell the grease paint, as it were, up close. On a good day I got to be director of the play. On a bad day it felt more like being the wardrobe assistant. But working inside the National Academy of Science was an amazing base from which to do science policy, to ask and occasionally to answer the burning social, ethical and political questions raised by and for science today. And while Martin Rees was president and I was working there, the Royal Society celebrated its 350th anniversary. This led us to think a lot about the Society's rich history. In its early years, the Society had been, as has been described by Stephen Shapin and other historians of science, at that time the Society was a house of experiment. Hooke, Boyle and the other early fellows met regularly to conduct experiments, to peer through newly invented telescopes and microscopes, and to dissect strange animals. Today, of course, while the Society still funds the work of several hundred research scientists, no actual experiments take place within the 4 walls of its base in London. Science moved out a long time ago into the universities and into the corporate R&D labs. But in other ways, a body like the Royal Society remains an experimental site. Only now the experiments that take place are in the messy and contested borderlands between science, politics and society. So my time, certainly at the Royal Society, gave me the opportunity to participate in scientific advice up close and to engage directly with many serving scientific advisors. But it also made me even more acutely aware of the contested and conditional context within which such advice is developed and applied. So to return briefly to Solly Zuckerman, there's sometimes a temptation in discussions of scientific advice to hark back to a rather idealised image of a golden age in which the advisor stands at the shoulder of the politician, helping him directly to interpret the implications of his or her research. And this photo very much reflects that ideal. Here we see Zuckerman, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister. This photo was taken in 1970. And it was taken at a place called Monk's Wood, which was then a centre for ecological research not far from Cambridge. And here we see Zuckerman, Wilson, a number of other scientists from that centre discussing the effects of pesticides on peregrines. But pull the camera lens back 100 yards or so, and this was the scene that same morning, an enormous protest outside the building by farmers who were upset about various aspects of the government's agricultural policies. So although the challenges we face in contemporary debates about climate change, GM crops, fracking or pesticides can at times seem daunting, and the degree of political contestation around those issues can often seem overwhelming, we need, I think, to draw lessons from other systems in the past and from other national systems now as to how we best organise and structure scientific advice. And that's what I want to move on to talk about. If we move from the UK to the international arena, this desire to learn more systematically across different national systems was the motivation for a large summit on scientific advice which took place a few weeks ago. At the end of August 2014, scientists and policymakers from 48 countries in total, ranging from Albania to Zimbabwe, gathered in Auckland, New Zealand, for this large meeting. This is the website of the meeting, and I was involved in the planning of this meeting, which was a fascinating and enjoyable process. Jointly hosted by Sir Peter Gluckman, pictured here, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and by the International Council for Science, ICSU. The Auckland Summit was the largest ever meeting of its kind, attracting science advisors, advisory bodies policymakers and science policy scholars from, as I say, a whole host of different nations. And the participants at that meeting debated the structures and methods for the provision of scientific advice. They talked particularly about emergency situations and how science advice copes with those, situations like the Ebola outbreak. They talked about how you organise scientific advice across different national and disciplinary boundaries. And they talked about how you cope with these highly contested topics where science, values and politics collide in often unpredictable and combustible ways. The meeting ended with a call to strengthen collaboration between different advisory systems and an agreement to meet again in 2016. As Sir Peter Gluckman said afterwards, our goal was to start a global conversation on the practices and challenges of conveying science advice to governments. This meeting's highlighted a real thirst among practitioners to share models and lessons. And I think if we look across a range of different governments and international institutions, we see precisely that heightened level of discussion and debate about the arrangements and methods for scientific advice and evidence-informed policy making. In some contexts, in some countries, new structures are being established. And although we need to respect the diversity of different systems, they are often the product of different political cultures, there's also a lot of scope to learn more systematically from one system to another. If we look at the moment at the developments we see across the scientific advisory landscape, New Zealand, the European Commission are two prominent examples of countries that have appointed chief scientific advisors in recent years. Similar discussions are underway in countries like Finland, which is in the process of debating reform of its science advisory system, and in Japan, where discussion of structures like a chief scientist have been part of the post-Fukushima, post-2011 debate. Moving up to the international level, we see fresh efforts to organise cross-national, international assessments that rely on scientific advice. And this is one example, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Also at the UN level, a new advisory committee has been established to provide scientific advice to the UN system. Institutions for scientific advice reflect distinctive cultures and traditions of decision making, what Sheila Jasanoff at Harvard has termed the civic epistemologies through which expert claims are constructed, validated or challenged in a given society. And as Jasanoff argues, good science in public decision making can't be divorced from deeper reflection on the way in which democracies should reason. But within this diversity, four structures stand out as most commonly used, often in combination across particular systems. So to summarise those four in brief, this is a slide of the UK system as one example of how these different bits fit together. The four main structures we see in most systems are firstly advisory councils. A lot of countries have some kind of high-level council or committee for science or science and innovation policy. Members typically include senior scientists alongside representatives of industry, higher education, sometimes civil society, who come together and advise either the Prime Minister directly or the Cabinet on the direction of policy. Examples include Japan's Council for Science, Technology and Innovation, the UK's Council on Science and Technology, and the US President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST. And just this week, in fact, the Australian government has just announced the creation of a new Commonwealth Council for Science and Innovation Policy that will be chaired by Ian Chubb, Australia's chief scientist, and will advise the Prime Minister. In addition to those kind of high-level councils, the second structure we see frequently in different national systems is that of advisory committees, and these tend to be more often focused on particular technical specialist domains, where you bring together the deep subject experts on a given topic who can advise on particular technical or regulatory issues, for example in health, environment or food safety. The US and Japan have hundreds of these committees across government. The UK has over 70. A third structure that again we see in many countries is that of national academies and learned societies, and the Royal Society of course is the UK's foremost example. But we see national academies in many different contexts, and a growing number of these are active in science policy in countries like Canada, China, Germany, the Netherlands, South Africa and the US and UK. And above individual academies, there are also a number of networks of national academies which enable different national academies to speak collectively with one voice. This is one example, the Inter-Academy Panel, which is a global network of science academies from 107 countries, and the International Council for Science, which I mentioned earlier, the co-host of the Auckland meeting, has a membership of 121 national bodies representing 141 countries. And then the fourth institution is the one I've already been talking about. That's the role of chief scientific advisors. In a growing number of countries, as I say, individual CSAs are a highly visible and vital part of the mix. If you like, they're the charismatic megafauna of the ecosystem of science advice. None of these structures, committees, academies, chief scientific advisors, is perfect. And governments typically rely on two or more of these in combination to create a broad ecosystem of expertise around policy processes. In the UK, there's a clear hierarchy. We have the government chief scientific advisor as the most senior figure, and then the other bits of the system sort of feeding in around him. In the US, while the presidential science advisor is also crucial, the system in general is more decentralised. There are multiple points of entry and less attempt at central coordination from the White House. But despite all the diversity we see in these different systems, I think common challenges persist across pretty much every national system. How to protect the independence of advice while ensuring that it's listened to, how to develop a trusted relationship with policymakers while maintaining transparency and accountability in the eyes of the public and the science community alike, and how to undertake appropriate quality assurance in the sorts of scientific advisory processes that are used. Looking across a range of different systems around the world, we see an emerging body of best practice and analysis of what works or doesn't in particular contexts. And I want to end by drawing out just a few of these common themes, these common challenges to which a lot of the research effort in this area has been addressed in recent years. The first of these is how to meet the demands and rhythms of the policy process. Debates about scientific advice often focus on the supply side of the science policy relationship, but the demand side is equally important. An effective advisor needs a very sophisticated understanding of how policy-making processes work and the pressures and constraints under which ministers, civil servants and decision makers operate. Policy challenges arise across very different time horizons, and these require very different responses. Modes of scientific advice that are most useful in emergency situations, like the ones up here, will rarely be the same as those required for long-term foresight or horizon scanning, looking at the direction of new technologies and their implication for society. Over the past decade, most scientific advisory systems have had to navigate crises with scientific dimensions. Countries such as Japan, New Zealand and the UK now have improved protocol for scientific advice in emergencies. This is an example in the UK, what's known as the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE. A key part of doing advice in these emergency situations is communicating to the wider public, providing clear advice while also acknowledging areas of scientific uncertainty. Some other structures are better suited at providing formal advice against a longer term horizon. National academies are a very good example of this, and they typically work by convening expert panels and producing detailed reports which can take a year or more to develop. Other structures like chief scientific advisors may find it easier to provide rapid informal advice in emergencies by gathering inputs from a range of sources or forming ad hoc committees as required to deal with particular issues. So responding to the different rhythms of policy making and striking the right balance between formal and informal types of input are crucial aspects of effective scientific advice. A second theme that arises in many systems is the need to distinguish between what we sometimes call a shorthand science for policy and policy for science. I'm putting those in inverted commas. In many systems, advisors or advisory bodies combine a responsibility for the use of scientific evidence in policy making, so-called science for policy, with a role in determining the budgets and structures of the research and innovation system, so-called policy for science. The lines between these two can easily become blurred, not least because areas of science for policy can easily have implications for particular research priorities or the funding structure. But where possible, it's useful and important to try and keep these roles distinct, to avoid limiting the advisor's remit by being seen primarily as a lobbyist for more resources for science rather than a figure supporting the use of evidence in the policy process. Given their links and proximity to the scientific community, it can be quite difficult for scientific advisors sometimes to extend the same commitment to impartial evidence to the management of the research system that they bring to other areas of policy. But it can be done, and former US presidential science advisor John Marburger, shown here, is one good example. He won plaudits for his willingness in a big speech in 2006 to ask tough questions of the research base about the evidence for more investment in research. And the questions he asked here, he says it's well to keep in mind how primitive the framework is that we use to evaluate policies and assess strength in science and technology. These kind of questions led to the creation in the US of what's now become a significant strand of research on the science of science and innovation policy, funded by the National Science Foundation. My third cross-cutting theme is the need for advisors to act as intermediaries, brokers and communicators. And this was a strong theme of this book, which I and a colleague, Rob Doubleday, edited and published last year to coincide with Sir Mark Wolpert, shown here, taking up the office, the current office of GCSA in the UK system. Scientists are typically appointed advisors because of their deep expertise and standing in a particular field. They're very eminent in one field or another, and this leads to them becoming involved in policy, usually first in that defined area and then more broadly across government. But once they're in the role of government chief scientist or departmental chief scientist, they're probably only going to be asked very rarely for advice that draws on that deep technical expertise. Far more often their role is to act as intermediaries, able to translate, aggregate and synthesise a variety of perspectives and sources of evidence from across the scientific system. Roger Pielke Jr., a science policy scholar at the University of Colorado, identifies several different roles that scientists can play in policy making and suggests that the most crucial of these is that of the so-called honest broker, who's able to help decision makers to choose wisely between the available options on a given topic. A related point is made by Ottmar Edenhofer, who until recently chaired Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He offers a related metaphor of the scientific advisor as a cartographer or map maker of different policy paths. Both Pielke Jr. and Edenhofer emphasise that it's important for advisors to be clear when they're moving from honest broker mode into more explicit advocacy of a particular policy position, as inevitably happens from time to time, as a failure to be explicit, a failure to acknowledge that shift, can very easily undermine trust in the advisory system. My fourth point relates to the obstacles, the difficulties of resolving conflicts of values purely through appeals to facts. Scientific advisors in most systems spend a lot of their time engaged in debates that reflect what some have dubbed as post-normal science, where facts are uncertain, values are in dispute, stakes are high and decisions are urgent. Any issue where science is an important factor but where values, ethics and politics are also in tension is unlikely to be resolved through a simple statement of the scientific evidence. Scientific advisors aren't superheroes. They can't swoop down and single-handedly sort out the messiness of politics in these difficult debates. They can't cut through the intractable knots that we often find where science, technology and values collide. To assume some kind of linear relationship between evidence and policy making is often a mistake, and advisors need to recognise the many ways in which evidence, values and political judgments combine to produce decision making. This isn't to deny that science should hold some kind of privileged place among the types of knowledge that may be meaningful to policymakers, but this privilege is fragile and depends on not overstating what's known and on acknowledging scientific limits and uncertainties. My fifth point is that we see, again in many different systems, an increased reliance on multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary forms of expertise. There's a growing recognition that identifying solutions to the kind of cross-cutting policy problems, the big challenges that confront contemporary governments, will require input not only from natural scientists but also from engineers, social scientists and other experts. For example, in the UK it's now accepted that social scientists should form part of the network of departmental chief scientific advisors, and bodies like the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology have recently established a social science section to strengthen the input of social science. Some bodies have argued for the creation of separate posts, chief social scientists, to provide the conduit for that kind of advice. Others have called for chief historians to provide a rear view mirror, a look back in the policy process. I think these arguments have some merit in the context of the advisory system as a whole, but my general preference would be to look at ways of integrating multiple forms of expertise in the system rather than creating standalone separate structures. And I think in this context it's quite helpful to distinguish between multidisciplinarity, which is usually about building better links between different disciplines, each of which continues to rely on its usual methods and modes of inquiry, and genuine interdisciplinarity, which encourages different disciplines to cross existing established subject boundaries to work in new and unexpected ways, enabling what my colleague Andy Sterling here at Sprue argues are more radical interactions between different styles of knowledge, fostering potentially transformative solutions. So it's that sort of sweet spot of interdisciplinary advice that I think the most sophisticated advisory systems are now aiming for. Sixth, we see a real need in a number of different systems to better link scientific advice to broader discussions and developments in evidence-informed policy making. In a number of different countries, governments are expressing a lot of enthusiasm for evidence-based policy and are trying out various experimental models of policy making in which scientific methods, particularly methods like randomised controlled trials, are used to test out, evaluate and inform different policy options. So here in the UK we have the Behavioural Insights team, the so-called nudge unit inside the Cabinet Office, which has been trialling out various RCTs and other methods over the past 4 years. And we see similar schemes and initiatives in the US and even in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where they're also looking at these debates with interest. It's important that they are connected up with the science advice system, and often the impetus behind these kind of initiatives, this is another example, the network of What Works centres that's been set up across the UK to bring together interdisciplinary expertise on key policy questions. Those kind of initiatives are often driven more from the demand side, more from within the policy system, and they aren't always as joined up as they might be with the supply side of scientific advice. So there's a job to be done to better integrate and connect these different inputs. And then my final thematic point is about the role of more diverse public inputs to the science policy process. We've seen, certainly in a country like the UK over the last 10-15 years, a real increase in the amount of investment and effort that's gone into various forms of public dialogue in the science policy system. Within Whitehall now there's a lot of discussion as this slide indicates, about so-called open policy making, ways of making the policy system more porous and receptive to ideas and expertise from outside. But we need to be constantly looking for ways to meaningfully engage that broader and more diverse set of voices and perspectives from civil society and the public in the policy process. I'm part at the moment of a committee that's evaluating 10 years of this organisation, the ScienceWise programme, which was set up by the UK government in 2004 to foster more of this kind of dialogue. And I think we see a lot of exciting progress, but also a number of areas in which the connections between dialogue and actual decision making could be improved. The Auckland summit that I mentioned was particularly timely for discussions of scientific advice here in Europe because it came at a time over the summer of 2014 when a war of letters had broken out between critics and supporters of the post of a chief scientist to the President of the European Commission. The incumbent in that role, Professor Anne Glover, who was the first person to fill that office, she took up the role in 2012, stands down about now as part of the transition from the Barroso to Juncker presidencies of the European Commission. And it's not yet clear whether the role of a chief scientific advisor to the President of the Commission will be renewed. Anne Glover talked quite openly about this at the Auckland summit and didn't disguise the difficulties that she'd experienced in embedding the new role of a CSA within existing Commission structures. She spoke about the highlights of her 1,000 days in the job and also many of the challenges that she'd experienced. But the key question, I think, that surrounds her role, which links to some of these broader debates around the future of scientific advice, is whether the European Commission and Parliament can find better ways of connecting evidence-gathering processes to the overall decision-making structure. Anne Glover herself has called in recent months for the creation of a central evidence service within the European Commission, working with the chief scientist to assess policy proposals in light of the best available science. And one can imagine how such a function could be housed in or alongside a body like the Joint Research Centre that exists within Brussels to support analytical work and evidence gathering in policy. The letter that was written to incoming President Juncker in the summer from a group of environmental NGOs took a very different approach. It was very critical of the CSA role, and the letter argued that the post of CSA is fundamentally problematic in that it concentrates too much influence in one person, undermines in-depth scientific research and assessments carried out by and for the Commission in the course of policy elaboration. And this intervention by a group of NGOs led to a flurry of letters from the opposite direction, from scientific bodies, some industry bodies, calling for the role of the CSA in Europe to be preserved. My own view on this is that the CSA role does deserve to be renewed. As I say, CSAs can't single-handedly cut through the messiness and contestation of different political debates, and a lot of what was going on in this particular discussion was influenced by arguments about GM crops in particular. But if we look around the world at different science advisory systems, we see that chief scientists in particular as one structure can make a positive difference, providing they have proper support, sufficient resources and appropriate protocols around independence and the transparency of advice. More than anything else, I think CSAs act as a magnifying device. They're able to draw on and pull in a much wider and more distributed ecosystem of expertise and focus that contribution in a way that's timely, relevant and useful to the policy process. So I think in the case of Europe, it's in the interests of all of us who see evidence as vital to good policy making that the role of the chief scientist should survive into 2015 and beyond, and we wait to see the outcome of that debate. My closing point sort of brings things back here to SPRU and the work of science policy scholars at the University of Sussex and elsewhere. We see that there are growing opportunities to link science policy research more closely to practice. Jeff Mulgan, the former head of policy in Number 10, who wrote in the green book I showed earlier a chapter about scientific advice, reminds us in that chapter that there's a science as well as a craft of scientific advice, and he argues that advisors need to draw more systematically on research in political science, social psychology, behavioural economics and science policy, which can investigate why certain kinds of knowledge are acted upon and others not. This, I think, requires concerted efforts from both sides, academics and practitioners, to connect the latest scholarship to advisory processes and practices. And building and operationalising those kind of links was another focus of the Auckland Summit that I've mentioned. At the risk of slipping from honest broker to advocate for my own field, I do think we need also to invest more in systematic comparative analysis and evaluation of different scientific advisory systems. SPRU, of course, has been very much involved in these debates over many years as Europe's largest and oldest centre for science and innovation policy research. And I think, given the timeliness of these debates and the prominence that they've had recently through the Auckland Summit and other discussions, there should be real scope to deepen and strengthen the amount of research that's going on in this field and the connections that it has to policy. SPRU may not be quite as old as the institution of the Chief Scientific Advisor. It was set up in 1966 and the GCSA, as I say, was founded in 1964. But there's certainly been a long tradition of exchange between those two institutions and its research agenda, to which I hope we contribute a great deal more in the years ahead. Thank you very much.